You know, even though I have this YouTube channel, which is literally dedicated to talking about games, I actually wouldn't go as far as to say I love games in general. Rather, I love some games. The ones which manage to stand out amidst the sea of bland mediocrity. Unfortunately, I turned 30 last year, and a temperamental aspect which seemed to accompany that transition was an intensified intolerance for mediocrity, applying to shows, films, music, and certainly games. I won't lie, I think most games suck, though maybe the same can be said for my videos, you be the judge. However, please do not think me the callous cynic, eager to disregard and dismiss, because when I do find a game I like, I really like it. I want to talk about it and tell everyone how great it is, hoping they'll try it too, or even just for like-minded fans of the game to watch my stuff and say, yes, this guy gets it. Well, if there's one thing I like, it's Dark Souls, and Demon Souls, and Bloodborne, and Sekiro, and on June of 2019, just 3 months after the release of Sekiro, I and millions of others saw another thing we liked, FromSoft's newest game, Elden Ring. Now I don't really get too excited for games these days, but that first reveal trailer got me hyped, because that might just have been the sickest trailer for anything, ever. Of course, no gameplay was shown, and furthermore the game wouldn't even come out for another 2 years and 8 months, often with long stretches of time with no news or updates from FromSoft, but finally, on February of 2022, we got it. I even received the game through the post a day before its official release date, which is always sick. The same thing happened to me with Bloodborne too, actually. Although Elden Ring's predecessor, Sekiro, very much did its own thing, dispensing with several Soulsborne staples, Elden Ring brought them right back, and indeed, many were quick to point out the striking similarities in both the appearance and feel of Elden Ring when compared to Dark Souls 3. It can't be denied that there certainly was a lot carried over from that final Dark Souls game, but luckily for me and everyone else, Dark Souls 3 is one of the best games ever made, so this was never really a problem as far as I was concerned. But Elden Ring did undoubtedly craft its own unique identity too, not least of all with the fact that it was FromSoft's first true open world game, boasting a map so expansive that it took many people by surprise, myself included. It would also introduce mounted travel and combat, and even crafting mechanics, and it even brought over some minor stealth elements from Sekiro, albeit to a lesser degree. Furthermore, if anyone thought FromSoft might finally be going all soft and mainstream with the whole open world thing, then the merciless difficulty of the game soon put those notions to rest, because Elden Ring is a brutally difficult game with some of the hardest bosses of any modern FromSoft game, to the extent that the difficulty sometimes felt somewhat, shall we say, excessive. There's so much to talk about with Elden Ring that I felt genuinely intimidated at the prospect of making a video on it, hence why I'm doing this all in several parts. Otherwise I'm going to end up with a 5 or 6 hour long video that barely anyone will even watch anyway. I'm estimating a further 2 parts to this series after this one, but it might end up being more. We'll see what happens. So, with that said, let's crack on with the video and talk about Elden Ring. Just before that though, if you haven't played this game before and are worried about spoilers, might be best to avoid this video for now because I will occasionally show later game areas and bosses, although I won't be spoiling any story stuff. Also, if anyone enjoys the video, then I'd sure appreciate it if you can please go ahead and give a like, and maybe even subscribe, and perhaps even check out my retrospectives on the Dark Souls trilogy and Sekiro. Many thanks. Just to let you know what to expect from the structure of this video, I will first provide an introduction to the world and story, and then from there I'll cover the game's first 3 regions, Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula and Liurnia. I'll be highlighting key locations, bosses and characters, as well as discussing some of the game's mechanics in between, though this isn't going to be some sort of exhaustive list of every POI of interest or anything. Rather, it's intended to be a fun and hopefully interesting commentary on the game, with a bit of analysis sprinkled in from time to time. I sure hope you like it. Elden Ring isn't just the title of the game, but also the name of a golden symbol representing the laws of the in-game world. It's very difficult to even describe what the Elden Ring truly is, and to what extent it's even a physical object or entity, but essentially it is made up of interlocking runes, each of which play a part in determining what can and cannot be in the lands between, where Elden Ring is set. As a result of a murderous incident known as the Night of the Black Knives, where her son's life was taken, the goddess Queen Margit shattered the Elden Ring after being, as the game puts it, driven to the brink. This act started a long, chaotic and bloody war known as the Shattering, where Queen Margit's demigod children each claimed fragments, or great runes, of the Elden Ring for themselves, warring amongst themselves to reclaim more great runes so as to eventually wield the power of the Elden Ring. However, none of the demigods would come out on top, leading to each of them either hiding away, transforming, or being reduced to shadows of their former selves. Thus, much like with the Unkindled from Dark Souls 3, the only remaining solution lay with the people known as the Tarnished. The Tarnished were warriors who were once abandoned by the mysterious higher consciousness known as the Greater Will, with the term Tarnished coming from the grace of gold which had left their eyes after their abandonment and then banishment. Now, however, their grace has returned and they've been given life once again, and beckoned back to the lands between to hunt down the demigods, reclaim their great runes, and ultimately to restore the Elden Ring. Now, while we're on the subject of the world and lore and story, let me say that Elden Ring is very complex in this regard. The game is massive, and so appropriately, the lore is also massive, with a lot of ambiguity and unanswered questions. When it comes to my coverage of the story, I won't be going super in depth about anything because I am not a lore hunter type in the slightest. I love the world and lore of Elden Ring, but I'm the kind of person who beat this game the first time and understood literally none of what happened. Yes, I'm fascinated by it, but if I hadn't watched hours of lore videos afterwards, I'd still be scratching my head wondering who the hell Radagon even was. That said, I will try to offer up the occasional nugget of lore from time to time to give things more context. And of course, to start off the game, we get to choose our class. The stats in Elden Ring are mostly pretty standard, although endurance has been converted back to how it was back in Dark Souls 1, determining both stamina and equip load capacity. There's also an arcane stat being added, but this mostly works as a luck stat, determining item discovery, although it is also a factor for the scaling of some weapons, as well as a stat requirement for dragon incantations. For my recent retrospectives of the Dark Souls games, I tried to go with a different sort of build each time, and so I decided here that I'd choose the Prisoner class and focus on a strength intelligence build, having never dabbled too much into sorcery in this game before, though to be honest, I mainly just wanted to use this specific sword, it just looks so cool. Upon first getting control of Elden Ring, what's immediately apparent is just how controllable it feels. If I had to describe both the feel and look of the movement, I'd say it's a cross between Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, not least of all because we can now jump. Other than that wonderful gameplay inclusion, which will of course frequently come into play during traversal of both the game's open world and dungeons, everything else feels pretty damn familiar, and all the basic moves from Dark Souls 3 are back. Of course, it's not long before we're thrown a nasty challenge with a rather terrifying boss ambush from a grafted Scion. Just as how Sekiro kicked the game off with a boss that players were almost certain to die on, the same thing is done here, because this enemy is ridiculously tough, not to mention being pretty damn tanky. In fact, you see grafted Scions a bunch more later on in the game as regular enemies, and for me, these things never stopped being a nightmare to fight. In fact, I still don't really understand how to fight them and not get hit, which is a problem. And that goes for quite a few of Elden Ring's enemies and some bosses. Is it perhaps because I'm just not all that great at these games? Yes. Yes it is. Of course, I die, as will most people here, though please let me know in the comments if you actually managed to beat this thing first try and claimed its fancy sword. The screen goes all dark for what seems like a bit too long, making everyone think, oh shit, the game's crashed, and then everyone sighs in relief as they see a very important character who we'll meet again later watching over us, along with a horse, Cow. From here, our character regains consciousness and we get our flasks of Crimson Tears for healing and Cerulean Teals for FP recovery. Same idea as the Estus and Ashen Estus from Dark Souls 3. Also, you can choose to drop down this hole to run through a very easy wee tutorial going over the basic combat mechanics, except loads of people, including me, completely missed this on their first playthrough. See this message that pops up? Yeah, that didn't used to be there. They patched it in because too many people missed out on this incredible boss. Finally, after the tutorial is done, we ascend an elevator, lift up the Iron Gate and step out into Limgrave. That moment where the player is finally allowed to see the world which awaits them after its intro sequence is very important for nearly any open world game, generating that initial burst of excitement and desire to get out there and explore. Elden Ring does this exceptionally well, showing bright green vistas, crumbling ruins, an enormous fortified castle sat on cliffs of jagged rock, and most spectacularly of all, the Erdtree. The Erdtree is of course the single biggest landmark in all the lands between, and can be seen from nearly anywhere. It looks impossibly enormous from a distance here in Limgrave, however, as the player travels through the world and comes closer and closer to it, you really start to realise just how absurdly tall and wide the thing actually is, not to mention beautiful. In fact, you could even say that it is incandescent. And it's a genius level move to always have it there looking over you in the distance, because the Erdtree is an extremely significant part of the culture of the people in the lands between, arguably being even more a subject of worship than the actual gods and demigods of the land. As bright, powerful and beautiful as the Erdtree is, however, like many things in this game, there are dark and disturbing aspects to it also. From this point on in the game, the player effectively is released into the wild. Of course, we have our mission to hunt the demigods and reclaim the Great Runes, but that's about it. Elden Ring did well to buck the trend of constant hand-holding, tutorials and having the protagonist constantly talk. The whole protagonist constantly speaking thing in particular is a massive peeve of mine in modern games, and I remember just a week before Elden Ring came out, Horizon Forbidden West came out, which I was actually looking forward to, and then I played it, and then I hated it for many reasons, but one of the main reasons I hated it was because the protagonist never shut up, and you were never allowed to figure things out for yourself, and I can't stand that. In Elden Ring though, there is no mission screen and there are no objective markers. What there is, however, is guidance in the form of dialogue by NPCs, as well as guidance in the form of grace. Although once ubiquitous throughout the lands between, grace is now something only visible to the tarnished, and not even all tarnished, only a select few. Like many things in Elden Ring, the guidance of grace is a very mysterious force, but it is thought to be a manifestation of the guidance by the greater will, visible as rays of gold which point in the direction of other points of grace and towards the closest relevant objective. Points of grace are, of course, this game's answer to bonfires, functioning in much the same way, except now any point of grace can be warped to from nearly anywhere else in the world, regardless of the player's current proximity to any other point of grace. The only exceptions to this are when the player is deep within an optional dungeon, or when in the middle of combat. Regarding NPC guidance, the white mask Vari is right within eyeshot of the player upon entering out into Limgrave, telling us that we're apparently kind of fucked due to being maidenless, thus being bereft of the power to turn runes into strength. Although it's quite easy to miss its significance, back in the very first room of the game we actually see our maiden lying dead on the ground, murdered, and indeed for the first small chunk of the game there is actually no levelling up, although we can still accumulate runes through combat and by slaughtering small animals. Regardless of the roasting we received from Vari, we're not totally lost, because the grace of gold guides us still. Unfortunately though, Vari is not the only entity within eyesight from our starting point here, because everyone's nemesis, the Tree Sentinel, also prowls the area, atop his gold armoured steed, halberd in hand. Yes, this dude is brutal for any first time player. He hits like a truck, has wide range with his heavy halberd, has a way bigger health pool than what the player is ready for at this point, and is also just flat out intimidating. You've just been let out into this strange new world, still with starting gear and not at all levelled up, and then there's just this absolute unit trotting to and fro. You're not really intended to be able to beat this guy yet, though you 100% can, but probably best not to try for too long unless you want to start off the journey all flustered and frustrated. Best to come back a decent bit later and nail him then to claim his awesome weapon, which I'll probably never use. What you're supposed to do in the meantime though is trek to the nearby church to converse with the friendly nomad merchant there. These guys are found all throughout the lands between, often in the most unlikely and inhospitable of places, each of them having their own unique selections of stock, ranging from weapons, upgrade materials, armour, crafting recipes and more. Some people recommend that you kill each one you find, because anytime an NPC is killed in this game, You can claim their unique bell bearing, later allowing you to purchase their wares from one location, but personally, I can't ever be the bad guy in games, I feel too guilty. Also, if you attack one of these guys, every other merchant in the game will aggro against you on sight. Like pretty much every region in the game, Limgrave is massive and there's tons to do here, but the main objective rests within the enormous structure in the distance, Stormveil Castle. Most of the game's regions are essentially large, open spaces filled with enemies, camps, mines, catacombs, caves, bosses, treasure, and far more. However, the goal of the Tarnished is to retrieve the great runes from the demigods, and Limgrave's demigod is a grotesque abomination known as Godrick the Grafted, hidden away inside Stormveil Castle. Much like the Erdtree, Stormveil Castle is visible from most parts of Limgrave, beckoning the player closer to take part in the true challenge of the region. But the beauty of Elden Ring is of course that it is an open world game, and that not only do you not have to take on that challenge right away, but you probably shouldn't, because there's so much more to see first. Although a person might assume that they're pretty much restricted to Limgrave at the start, or even that the whole game might just take place in Limgrave, nothing could be further from the truth. When you realise just how much of the game world you can actually travel to, all without fighting a single boss at the start of the game, it is wild. In fact, see Stormveil Castle. You never have to go there if you don't want to. It is totally optional. You should go there because it's sick. You should go to most places in this game, but you don't have to. See, it's totally standard for open world games to have a crap load of optional content, side quests and subquests and hunts and challenges, God knows what else. And of course, you'll usually have the main questline, which must be played through in its entirety to complete that game. In Elden Ring though, as well as the massive volume of side content like its dungeons, the optional bosses, the NPC questlines and more, even most of its main story content, the highest quality stuff in the game is totally optional. There are massive regions and levels which you never have to set foot in if you don't want to. Of course, FromSoft have always dabbled in this sort of thing. Look at the Painted World from Dark Souls 1, or Archdragon Peak from Dark Souls 3, or Cainhurst from Bloodborne. But Elden Ring takes this to a whole new level, and in fact, the vast majority of this game can actually be bypassed if you really want. And there's a certain bold confidence about that, which I love, because Elden Ring fucking knows you'll visit these levels anyway, even though you don't have to, because it's such a compelling game. Limgrave is a swell place to explore and try out the combat, and especially the stealth. There's a nearby outpost at a gate filled with knights, dogs and horn-wielding lookouts, serving as a pretty formidable challenge for the player to test out the mechanics. Like I said in the introduction, stealth does exist in this game, but I wouldn't exactly call it a stealth game. In fact, other than the new ability to crouch, there aren't really any other stealth mechanics, so no aerial death blows here I'm afraid. Nonetheless, the ability to sneak up on enemies from behind is crucial in the early stages of the game, because the player's stats are still low due to not being able to level up yet, and also the total number of heals from the Crimson Flask starts out pretty low too, and even lower if you're a filthy magic user like me, with a Cerulean Flask or two allotted for restoring FP. As far as sneaking around goes, I definitely did find that I relied on it less as the game progressed, as my character got increasingly more formidable, but hey, a backstab is a backstab, and being able to move silently whilst crouching is a welcome addition, whereas before you just had to casually walk up behind an enemy to backstab them and hope they didn't hear you. Also found in these ruins is a wee downstairs bit containing a chest, and this continues to be a feature for many of the game's ruins sections, which also often contain a hidden section leading down to a piece of sweet new loot or a boss. In this particular chest though, we found our first Ash of War, with these serving as additional flashy skills which can be added onto weapons. They effectively function the same as the weapon arts from Dark Souls 3, except here you can switch the weapon arts around from weapon to weapon. I'll go into more detail on Ashes of War later on though. After clearing the camp, including the especially tough larger knight with the great shield, the large spear and the floppy hair thing coming out of his helmet, this is the place where most players are reunited with Melina. I say reunited because Melina is the one we briefly hear and see after being yeeted down from the Chapel of Anticipation at the very start of the game. She tells us that in exchange for us journeying and taking her to the foot of the Erdtree, she will effectively act as our handmaiden, allowing us to turn runes into strength, to level up. Furthermore, she has another fun gift, the gift of horse. No, not heroine, I'm talking about Torrent, a noble steed. A lot of folk were excited when they first saw the character riding around and attacking whilst on a horse in the early trailers, but many also wondered how exactly that would feel in a FromSoft game. The Dark Souls games had quite a distinctive, perhaps even clunky feel, although Dark Souls 3 certainly did feel more fast and fluid, with Sekiro being faster still. Horse controls do tend to be a thing which some open world game developers struggle with though, with realism not always being the greatest compliment to making something feel fun, but thankfully, realism is hardly much of a focus in Elden Ring, and so Torrent instantly feels fantastic to ride around on. There's no acceleration button here, you just move the analog stick in a direction and that's where he moves. Furthermore, Torrent can double jump, instantly making the open world feel more accessible, traversable and explorable. It can also be mounted from nearly anywhere except dungeons, and they even made it nearly instantaneous, having Torrent simply materialise through the use of a key item, as opposed to having to fanny around whistling after horses all day. A very nice natural feature located at various points around the lands between are spirit springs, allowing Torrent to jump up into the air to incredible heights, as well as land back on the ground with zero fall damage. These can be located in places for the purposes of convenience, for reaching an otherwise inaccessible part of the level, or even just for a bit of treasure, or even just for a bit of pleasure. Pretty much the one and only criticism I have with Torrent's movement is that it doesn't really evolve at all from the start of the game to the end. You don't unlock any additional movement options or upgrades, and there's not even a way to customise Torrent's appearance. Come on, what's up with that? We've got fashion souls, so how about horse souls? Fashion horse? Ugh, well, maybe in the DLC. And so, with the power to level up and the power of a horse, this is an excellent time to explore. Like I said, Limgrave alone is enormous, never mind the rest of the map, and I'm betting there's parts of it that I still have never seen. Just a bit to the east, there's Agheel Lake, which also happens to be the site of a cult of dragon worshippers. Never a good thing. A nearby character named Yura warns us of the dragon, Agheel, telling us to stay away from the lake unless we're looking for a swift, crispy death. Shut up, Yura, I know what I'm doing. A really cool inclusion here is that if you die to the dragon, then go back to Yura, he'll offer to help, and then you can summon him for the dragon fight. I intended to do this, but then I just couldn't remember where his summon sign was, and so I just beat Agheel solo. There are a lot of dragons found in the lands between, dragons who breathe fire, ice, magic, rot, and more. These fights tend to be quite challenging, however, most of the game's dragons do share a lot of the same moves, only with certain changes in element and additional moves here and there, and so once you've figured out how to deal with one of them, the same sort of strategy will basically hold true for a lot of them. I found Torrent to be crucial for effectively taking down dragons in this game, because the quickness with which you can summon him and generate decent speed in seconds comes in very handy for when the area starts getting bathed in flames. A lot of dragons have their own names and identities, being found in locations suited to their element, but in some areas you'll also find lesser dragons stomping about. After defeating Agheel, Yura tells us about the power of dragon communion. For every dragon defeated, you will gain a dragon heart, and if it's a named dragon like Agheel, Adua or X-Sykes, that dragon's particular power will be purchasable with dragon hearts, though they do tend to require a wee bit of investment in the arcane stat before they can be used. A very cool part of the lore is how those who partake in dragon communion begin to hunger more and more for dragon hearts, one day losing their humanity entirely, transforming into fearsome worms like Theodorix found in the consecrated snowfields. The deepest lore. After riding around in Limgrave for a bit on the back of Torrent, if you happen to travel back to the church near the start of the game, which most players likely will after they get enough runes to purchase more wares from the merchant there, you'll see a certain snow witch endearingly sat on a ledge while an enormous moon hangs high overhead in the background. The lady introduces herself as Renna and gifts us the spirit calling bell before imparting some commentary over the nature of the tarnished and their servility to an entity known as the Two Fingers. Although you can easily go through the whole game without ever meeting or thinking about this character ever again, she is actually key to one of the endings of the game, and a lot of steps and work are required to unlock this ending. As for the Spirit Caller Bell, this can be used to summon spirits into battle to help out with difficult encounters and bosses. There are tons of different spirit ashes to find, some of which are barely useful at all, while others are borderline overpowered. One spirit ash in particular, which received a lot of notoriety in the first months of the game being out due to the extent with which it trivialised a lot of bosses, was the Mimic Tier. This spirit ash is unlocked fairly late into the game, but essentially summons a carbon copy of your own character with all your same equipment, magic and damage output, and so it made for a great boon for many of us who were stuck on some of those more infuriating bosses towards the end of the game, though the Mimic Tier was eventually nerfed somewhat in a patch. There are certainly still some very strong spirit ashes though, like Lutel the Headless and Black Knight Tish. For this playthrough I used the occasional spirit ash here and there in the first, say, third of the game, and then stopped using them for the remainder. They really can be a big help, and I definitely recommend them for anyone on a first playthrough, as they make many encounters far more manageable. Plus, it's great fun trying them all out. There really are a lot of them. But for a second playthrough, I'd recommend trying to beat the game without using them at all. I remember back in my first playthrough, which I fucking struggled with, by the way. I couldn't imagine beating the game without ever using a Spirit Ash, but then I actually tried it and had an incredibly fun time. I even went on to beat the game with a level 1 character, although if I'm being honest, that was hell and I will never do that again. There are a bunch of other characters to meet too in Limgrave, but before I talk about any of the others, I have to give the spotlight, or should I say, potlight, to Alexander. Alexander is found in the north of Limgrave, finding himself stuck in the mud. I completely missed this guy in my first playthrough, and furthermore, every time I've played through this game again, I always need to look up where the fuck he is, because I can just never seem to find him. To be honest, that actually does relate to an issue with Elden Ring. It's extremely easy to miss things, characters in particular. It was hard enough in the Dark Souls games to follow NPC questlines, and nearly impossible without looking up a guide in many cases, but this is far worse in Elden Ring. Don't get me wrong, there are lots of characters and they have great questlines and top tier voice acting, but good bloody luck being fortunate enough to spot them out in this massive world. If you want to actually finish a lot of these questlines through to completion, while NPCs completely change location and region, sometimes with little to no indication of where they've even gone to next, yeah, you just need a guide sometimes, and that's something I've never really liked about NPCs in FromSoft games. There's a real difference between making something challenging and making it so that most players simply can't finish particular quests without looking up the wiki. And as a result, there's a bunch of questlines in this game I've still never finished, because I don't much like having my phone out looking down a checklist of where the hell I'm supposed to go next. And then you go there, and the character who is apparently supposed to be there just isn't there, so off you go to Google to see what you did wrong and where you need to go next to progress the questline. Of course, they did later mitigate this to some small degree in a post-release patch where the locations and names of NPCs are highlighted on the map, but they still won't show up on the map unless you found them there first, so still a pain in the arse. Alexander here actually shows up in a bunch of locations throughout the world, but I'm betting that most players probably see him in Limgrave, then next in Caelid before facing Radagon, then maybe again on Mount Gelmir where he's thoroughly tucked away, then in Farum Azula where he's even more well hidden. Another NPC found in Limgrave is Bock. Again, speaking of missing things, I totally missed this little monkey man on my first playthrough. I heard shouting over by the trees here, but could not for the life of me figure out where the fuck it was coming from. Of course, you're supposed to strike this vaguely conspicuous tree, but I just never figured that out when I first played the game. Am I a fool? I don't know. Bock is one of the very few sane and kind-hearted souls still remaining in the lands between, which is otherwise full of brutality, madness and death, and he tells us about a particular coastal cave where he was roughed up. This is a super cool section, because from very near this starting point, an isolated island can be spied just off the coast. Of course, you cannot swim in this game, and nor can you jump that far from Horsey McHorseface, but travelling through this dark cave, cutting into the cliff, chucks you out onto that island you saw from before. There's not a whole lot on the island, though there is a Dragon Communion altar where you can buy some dragon skills, but that first moment of realisation where you realise where you've just ended up is great. It's very important for open world games to do cool shit like this. Ever been playing one Would you feel like you figured the whole game out? Would you see the formula and have a pretty good idea of what to expect at any location you come across? It gets boring, doesn't it? That's why I love when open world games throw these cool curveballs, like when the spaceship randomly crash lands in Fallout 3. Surprise me, intrigue me. To the east of Limgrave lies the Mistwood, the forest canopy being far denser here, resulting in a somewhat gloomier, creepier atmosphere. Although again, easy to miss, you might come across some pompous prick shouting for help. Kenneth here gives you a quest to clear and retake his fort to the southeast of the Mistwood. I believe there's a whole further questline afterwards also associated with Kenneth, but yeah, never done it because I don't feel like looking up a step-by-step guide. The Mistwoods are likely where most people will come across their first minor Erdtree. While nowhere near as large as the Erdtree itself, its minor cousins are to be found at key points all throughout the lands between, always having some special treasure near the base to be used in the Flask of Wondrous Physic. This Flask of Wondrous Physic can be found in a church of Margit in the east of Limgrave, not too far from the Caelid border, and with it, the player can mix any dual combination of crystal tears, each of which can be found at specific minor Erdtrees, with each one having their own unique properties. Some of the effects can be rather uninteresting, like restoring half your health, while there are others which cancel out all FP usage for 15 seconds, allowing you to wipe out entire boss health bars with powerful sorceries FP cost free. As I mentioned, I've done a level 1 All Remembrances playthrough of Elden Ring, but doing a challenge like that was where I really appreciated the worth of the flask, because all of a sudden some of the effects from specific tiers became vital for enabling certain builds and setups to make certain enemies or bosses that little bit less painful. For a regular playthrough though, the flask feels useful but rarely vital. It can save your arse from time to time, but I often just used it for a bit of a damage buff, or to increase my survivability with maybe a stamina boost, or some healing over time. There's another important character deep in the Mistwood who's actually an integral part of one of the game's 6 endings, and that's Blaidd, the half-wolf. Anyone else just not see this dude on their first playthrough? I remember going to these ruins and beating this absolute unit of a rune bear, and I heard some forlorn howling, but just assumed it was some dumb wolf enemy somewhere nearby. Well no, it's actually a really important character who, although difficult to spot, is poised at the top of the ruins here. Going back to the merchant from the start of Limgrave and mentioning the howling to him gets you the snap gesture, which will apparently beckon him down from the top of the ruins. Again, although I got the snap gesture, I just never initially went back to Blaidd on my first playthrough because I didn't even see him up there to begin with, so I didn't even know what this prick was even referring to. I had to look all this shit up on the wiki for a step-by-step guide on how to do his entire questline. Very immersive. By the way, I will admit that some of these minor frustrations really are just caused by my own lack of attention in some cases, and to be honest, I'm not even saying that the game would be better if there was more direct guidance for specific questlines, because I think that might be in danger of making the whole experience feel a bit less special and mysterious. It's just that this is a big game with a big map. For example, there's another character we meet quite early on called Dialos, whose questline I have never been able to get properly started until I somehow ran into him on this playthrough. He's looking for a servant named Liurnia and gives the player zero guidance on where she might be found. Well, it turns out she's lying dead at this particular spot in the Liurnia region, which is a massive area by the way. So this is the first time I've spotted these two here, ever, and it only took me about 200 hours of playing the game. Back to Blaidd though, after snapping your fingers to beckon him down from the top of the ruins, kinda rude actually, you shouldn't snap your fingers at people. I'm sure everyone was surprised when they actually heard this dude talk, sounding like this.
He sent you, did he? Ever the bloody busybody. Maybe to him you don't seem so strange. The name's...
Don't get me wrong, this voice acting is superb, but I don't think it fits the character very much. I'm not saying he had to talk like this, like a big scary wolf, or anything, but I think they could have made him sound a bit more gruff and wolfy. By the way, to any people from outside the UK who likely aren't too clued up on the many different accents over here, from region to region and city to city, several characters from Elden Ring have Welsh accents, like Blaidd, Renna, E.g., Albus and Rennala, which is why their voices sound so nice and musical. Blaidd lets us know he's on the lookout for a certain someone, and that certain someone is to be found at the forlorn hound Evergaol. Even though Blaidd says to contact him if you find the location of this dude, that's actually not what you do at all. You enter the Evergaol and can summon Blaidd for help on what can be a very tough fight, especially if you take it on early, but winning the fight and talking to Blaidd afterwards finishes up his portion of the questline for now. Evergaols are located all around the world, and like many other locations and attractions, can actually be spotted on the map if you know what you're looking for. They'll always contain a boss fight, though these fights are never unique. They'll tend to just contain a boss enemy or even just a regular enemy you've already seen elsewhere, except with a boss health bar. They are still well worth doing though, because of the often excellent rewards given for victory. The first Evergaol most people will likely come across is the Stormveil Evergaol, found just off the road to Stormveil Castle. Although it's located close to the start of the game, victory initially will be out of reach for most people who take on this challenge, because the boss here is the Crucible Knight, essentially Elden Ring's answer to the Black Knight from Dark Souls 1 and 3. You'll likely come across many more Crucible Knights throughout your time in Elden Ring, and they are tough. At first, they'll exclusively utilise stomps, shield bashes, sweeping sword swings and surprising sword stabs. It can be really hard to squeeze in a heal when fighting Crucible Knights because they'll often charge at you from a distance right as you're healing with an annoying follow-up attack. Then in the second phase, they'll start using special attacks related to the aspects of the Crucible. Although their attacks are all very conventional and grounded at first, they will literally start flying around the arena in phase 2 and can easily wipe you out in a single hit. I know a lot of people aren't keen on these enemies due to how difficult and punishing their movesets are to deal with, but personally I love them, though I don't think I'll ever be able to take one down without getting hit at least once. They always manage to get in an attack just when I think I'm safe to hit or heal. Awesome armour design though, and that shield is just to die for. So much so that I started using it towards the end of the game. One last character I will cover before we start talking about the terrifying first major boss is Roderika, another Tarnished. She can be found in a hut in the Stormveil area of Limgrave and is alone, lamenting about the deaths of her friends and comrades, all having fallen victim to the spider. The spider she's referring to here is of course the demigod Godrick, so called Godrick the Grafted because of his cruel practice of grafting the limbs of tarnished aggressors onto his body. We see Roderika again later on, and if anything, she only becomes even more endearing. I just love the voice acting for her, just such a nice accent. There is also of course a ton of other stuff to do in Limgrave, however, like I said a while ago, I'm not going to try and cover everything at every region, because that would be mental, and this video is going to be long enough already. After the player feels well enough prepared, it's time to head further up Stormveil and closer to Stormveil Castle, and upon approaching the castle grounds, the player is introduced to a terror by the name of Margit, the Fell Omen.
Search of the Elden Ring. Emboldened by the flame of ambition.
Now this guy knows how to make an entrance. Margit is absolutely notorious for destroying new players. Although the very first encounter in the game is with the Grafted Scion and is far too difficult for 99% of players to beat on a first playthrough, you're not supposed to be able to beat it. Hence why the game progresses regardless of whether you win or lose that fight. Margit is a bit different though, because to progress onto Stormveil Castle, you do have to beat him, because he is a proper boss. Margit utilises wide, wild combos with his long staff, holy projectiles designed to counter attempts at magic or healing from a distance, and is where many players will first encounter a defining element of Elden Ring's combat, Blaidd attacks. See, although FromSoft's previous games did sometimes dabble in attack animations deliberately designed to throw off your timing, they weren't all that common, particularly in the Dark Souls games, where they were the exception rather than being core parts of those games' combat experience. That's because of the fact that in order for a player to be able to dodge or evade an enemy attack, the attack animation has to be understandable. You have to be able to tell what kind of attack it actually is, and when the startup animation ends and the actual hurtbox to be avoided begins, right there and then in the middle of the action. If the player cannot determine this, then they get hit, or panic roll and hope they get lucky with the timing. Elden Ring does not play by these rules at all though, and a lot of times the attack animation is specifically designed to throw you off, having long wind-ups followed by fast, sudden strikes. Elden Ring wasn't really the first FromSoft game to properly start incorporating this sort of thing though, because Sekiro had a ton of it too, as well as a greatly enhanced ability for enemy attacks to track the player mid-attack, further punishing the ill-timed roll. Sekiro also incorporated perilous attacks which, although a great inclusion to that game's combat, inevitably resulted in initial damage or death before the player would be able to suss out the appropriate defense or counter to the attack. The same is true in Elden Ring, and unless your gamer intuition is on a damn near superhuman level, you're going to be getting hit a lot by some extravagant attacks with long wind-up animations several times before you figure out when you're actually supposed to dodge the fucking thing. I'll highlight other enemies and bosses as appropriate who also utilise these kind of attacks, but that's all I'll say about them for now. Margit is very tough though. A buddy of mine who isn't into Souls games at all decided to try out Elden Ring to see what all the fuss was about, but then he made it to this boss and then got fucking rammed and then just put the game down. Of course, while Margit does seem impenetrable at first, the smart thing to do is to walk away and explore Limgrave first. If you march up Stormveil towards the castle to fight Margit near the beginning where your character has barely been developed and you're still using the equipment and spells you started with, it is highly unlikely to go well for you. But spend an hour or two exploring and having fun in Limgrave, finding upgrade materials, new gear, dungeons, talismans and runes to level up with, and this boss becomes far more manageable. He never really becomes easy, but there are many ways to make it easier, not least of all Spirit Ashes. I summoned a fucking jellyfish for this fight here, and it actually helped a ton. The very first time you beat Margit though, damn it feels good. The 12,000 runes and talisman pouch you get for your troubles make the victory feel that much sweeter. When the player beats Margit, Melina will again appear at the nearby Site of Grace, and for most players this is where they'll get the first opportunity to visit Elden Ring's hub area, the Roundtable Hold, possibly my favourite Soulsborne hub area. There are a bunch of characters to meet here, as well as some you meet out in the world who then migrate here, like Rodrika, Nephilim and Rogier, who we later see in Stormveil Castle, and Dee, who waits outside some undead ruins in the northeast of Limgrave. Upon first visiting the hold, the main man here, Gideon Ofnir, is rather cold, saying that although we should consider this place a sanctuary, that we are still merely a guest, a visitor, though after killing our first demigod later, he does open up a bit. The Roundtable Hold is indeed a sanctuary though, and unless you jump down to this area below the balcony here, this is a totally non-hostile area. The Hold is where several different characters' questlines can be initiated or progressed throughout the game, and it's really nice to have a safe haven to come back to and interact with these great characters and learn more about the world of Elden Ring and the culture of the lands between, and then when you're ready, go back out into the world to fight some giant skeleton torsos. Also, although the entire Elden Ring soundtrack is absolutely stellar, the Roundtable Hold music is my favourite track in the whole game. It's absolutely beautiful and so sad, and although I love Elden Ring as a whole, the soundtrack plays a significant role in that, especially this track. I used to listen to it when I was having a stressful time at work, and it would always calm me down. The designated smith of the Roundtable Hold is Master Hugh, He looks a bit strange, but that's because he's of a race of people known as the Misbegotten, though every other Misbegotten we encounter out in the world is hostile to us on sight. Hugh is chained up in the hold and tasked with helping out the Tarnished by improving our weapons to the point where they are powerful enough to kill a god, a purpose given to him by the enigmatic Queen Marika. Smithing is kept rather simple in Elden Ring, even more so than in Dark Souls 3, and certainly more so than in Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. Now there's only two different categories of upgrade materials: smithing stones or somber smithing stones, with the higher level versions of these materials simply having a number in brackets after them to indicate their strength. Although the naming convention is rather mundane, these items actually used to have much more interesting, although less clear, names back in the 1.0 version of the game, and I would highly recommend folk check out the excellent Berto Please channel with his meticulous and enjoyable documentation of the staggering number of significant differences between the unpatched version of Elden Ring and the version we all know now. Simply put, conventional weapons are upgraded with regular smithing stones, while special or boss weapons are upgraded with somber smithing stones. Furthermore, conventional weapons can be upgraded all the way to plus 25 in Elden Ring. I like how they had the max be plus 15 back in Dark Souls, and then they went, nah, that's too much, lower it to plus 10 in Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Bloodborne, and then went, nah, fuck it, let them upgrade weapons to plus 25 in Elden Ring. I didn't initially realise this in my first playthrough, and I remember being a bit disappointed that I already seemed to be close to maxing out my weapon at plus 13 or whatever it was, around halfway through the game, but then it just kept on letting me upgrade my weapon more and more, much to my delight. Elden Ring doesn't do anything in half measures. All the elements it brought over from the Souls games were turbocharged to make bigger and more extreme, and although the end result could certainly be called less refined and balanced compared to the somewhat smaller scale but tighter experiences of the Souls trilogy, I really appreciate just the number of things in this game. Special weapons along the somber upgrade path can only be maxed out to plus 10, though each upgrade increment is worth more damage output and scaling here, and as any Elden Ring player knows, there's a massive difference between the number of upgrade resources required for conventional weapons compared to somber weapons. For example, it literally takes 96 total regular smithing stones of different levels to max out a weapon to plus 25, whereas it takes just 9 total somber stones of different levels to max out a weapon to plus 10. Of course, regular smithing stones are strewn about through the world in far greater number compared to the somber variety, but even so, just the sheer number of materials and runes which have to be invested if you want to try out a new weapon can get somewhat tiresome, especially towards the end where you'll be wanting to use exclusively high level gear. The player will return back to the Roundtable Hold a lot throughout their journey, and you certainly do meet some interesting and dark characters there, but for now, we've got a demigod to hunt. He resides in Stormveil Castle beyond where we took down Margit, and his name is Robert Paulson. His name is Godrick the Grafted. Although there are many minor dungeons around the Lands Between for the player to delve into, over 50 in fact, I'll discuss these in more detail in the next video in the series, but there are also what are known as legacy dungeons. I'm not really sure where the term legacy dungeon actually came from, and to be honest I don't like it, but I guess I'll use it in this video just for convenience. There are a number of main legacy dungeons in the game, usually serving as the home of a demigod, and then you have many other areas which function similarly to legacy dungeons but which do not contain a demigod, such as the Lake of Rot, Redmane Castle and Caria Manor. The main shared feature across all these areas is that you cannot ride Torrent whilst within their boundaries. Furthermore, the large open design of the world becomes far more confined and refined in these areas, playing far more like traditional levels from the Dark Souls games, and the lack of ability to speed around and double jump to high places on Torrent in these levels further encourages the player to rely on more traditional means of level navigation. These dungeons still do contain several points of grace however, and what's more, fast travel can still be utilised from any point in these dungeons, even when indoors, and so while they are similar to minor dungeons in not allowing the use of Torrent, they do still allow you to easily escape or even just warp to a different point of grace in the larger level if you so desire. Although Elden Ring's open world is massive and painfully beautiful at times, it is also a fact that most of it does consist of relatively empty landscapes to be traversed through and admired, like most open world games. Thus, the requirement for actual level design isn't as crucial in these open areas, because often you're not so much navigating and figuring them out as much as just passing through. The Legacy dungeons, however, are where Elden Ring is able to fully flex its level design muscles, and these end up being the best areas in the game. Although I was both enchanted and intimidated by Limgrave on my first playthrough, I was blown the fuck away when I got to Stormveil Castle, because this area is of such high quality to play through, boasting the most intricate level design in the game thus far, by far. It's not disconnected from the rest of the open world, and the same can be said for most of this game's locations. You can often see a lot of the rest of the world from wherever you happen to be. For example, from Stormveil Castle, you can clearly see the Chapel of Anticipation in the distance where the player started the game. Shortcuts, elevators, locked doors, tough new enemies, armoured knights and deep, ominous secrets await the player's discovery in Stormveil Castle, and this place can truly be a challenge to navigate, with there often being cut off sections of the castle that you can see, but where it's not at all obvious how to actually get there. And if you really go digging into the depths of the castle, you can discover a large, unsettling growth resembling the visage of the mysterious Prince of Death, though not without first having to fight possibly the most chaotic and confusing enemy in the game. These monstrosities are known as ulcerated tree spirits, and they are one of the most common bosses in Elden Ring, often appearing within the depths of dungeons or near minor Erdtrees, or even just appearing out of nowhere. By the way, how bullshit was this death? The tree spirits' movements are bizarre and erratic as they wriggle and writhe around often cramped arenas, occasionally vaporising all in the vicinity with golden conflagrations. The trouble with this boss is that it can be hard to tell what it's actually doing, though after fighting them a bunch you do start to make sense of their animations. Tree spirits really aren't all that tough, but these fights always feel frantic and messy. In one particularly grisly hall within the castle prowls an old nemesis, a grafted scion. Although I was much more well kitted out than I had been at the very beginning of the game, I still had a brutal time trying to kill this thing and died a couple of times before I could down it. This enemy's design is incredible and so fucked up, especially when you get a closer look at the smaller details of its design, as pointed out by Zuli the Witch, but I hate fighting them. It almost never seems safe enough to actually attack, and its combos sometimes go on and on as it violently whirls and stabs throughout the hall. Through towards the end of Stormveil, we meet a character named Nepheli Lu, who offers to aid us in the upcoming battle against Godrick, an offer which I accepted. And indeed, just further up behind a large, intimidating golden fog gate awaits the grafted demigod himself.
Mighty dragon, thou'rt a true-born heir. Lend me thy strength, O kindred. Deliver me unto greater heights. Well. Alone tarnished. Plain as a lord. I command thee kneel. I am the lord of all that is golden.
Although we fought Margit earlier, who is actually a demigod too, Godrick is the first true runebearer, being a practitioner of grafting, whereby he removes the limbs of tarnished invaders to his castle and attaches them to himself to the point of inhuman, menacing horror. Various nuggets of lore regarding Godrick actually suggest that he's something of a coward, and though he is a demigod, he's also said to be a mere distant relation to Queen Marika, and thus he's grafted countless arms, legs, fingers and God knows what else to his frail form, transforming himself into the formidable monstrosity before us. Like Margit, Godrick can be a very challenging boss for new players, although I think to a lesser degree. He's very powerful and has some fucking crazy attacks, but for the most part this is a fair boss, and appropriately powerful considering he is a demigod. The transition cutscene into Godrick's second phase is one of the coolest, most savage cutscenes I've ever seen though.
truest of dragons. Lend me thy strength.
The man just chopped off his arm and attached a fucking dragon to the bloody stump, for God's sake. The noise the dragon makes as it splutters up blood and animates with its empty eye sockets has always been really freaky to me too, only adding to the badassery of this phase transition. Godrick will utilise fire attacks in the second phase, and these are designed to get you running and panicking. My favourite attack of his is his Groundquake as he rams his mighty axe into the ground, crushing and crumbling the stone beneath him, doing massive AoE damage. See, with the inclusion of the jump into Elden Ring, there's now the ability to avoid certain ground attacks with said jump. These ground attacks aren't super common, and it's quite easy to be unaware that certain attacks can even be jumped over to begin with, but it's a nice inclusion and makes battles more engaging and varied, but these jumps are made somewhat redundant due to the fact that any attack that you can jump over can also simply be dodge rolled, unlike say the sweep attacks from Sekiro which had to be jumped. But eventually Godrick goes down, rewarding us with some dialogue which almost makes you feel sorry for the guy if he wasn't such a prick. And also our first Great Rune and a Remembrance. Great Runes are of course integral to the main goal of the Tarnished in Elden Ring, that being to mend and restore the Elden Ring, but they also serve a practical purpose for combat, buffing the player up in different ways. However, although you can go ahead and equip your Great Rune from this point, it won't actually do a damn thing for you yet. In order for them to work, you've got to do two things. 1. Restore the Great Rune at its corresponding Divine Tower, usually located in the same region where you beat that demigod, and 2. Activate the power of that Great Rune by the use of a consumable called a Rune Arc. Divine Towers can be seen all over the lands between, standing far higher than near all other land masses and structures, and in each case they must be ascended to the highest point in order to restore the power of that Great Rune. The Divine Tower for Godrick's Rune happens to be very nearby, standing just adjacent to the castle. Of course, it's not as simple as simply going up the tower, because first we have to get to the tower, and it's guarded by some awesome enemies, the Guardian Golems. These golems were some of the first enemies we saw from the early promotional images of Elden Ring, and they look so sick. They're really not all that uncommon either, and you'll end up fighting a lot of them throughout your journey, sometimes stomping around in an area, shooting enormous great arrows from afar, or even lying inert on the ground, as is the case for the first one which most players will encounter on Stormveil. Very intimidating enemy with enormous range from their golem halberds, but once you get the hang of their moveset they actually go down real easy, quite literally. For most of them, it's just a case of attacking their ankles a few times until they collapse to the ground, allowing for a massively damaging critical hit to their smouldering cores. There are 3 golems to fight on the Great Bridge which leads to the Limgrave Divine Tower, but the difficulty of this encounter is significantly reduced due to the fact that the golem shooting arrows from the distance can actually knock down other enemy golems for you to then take out with criticals. Friendly fire amongst enemies was nearly unheard of except in very rare cases in the Dark Souls games, but it's here in a much bigger way in Elden Ring, particularly for larger enemies like golems, trolls, crabs and crawfish. It's not just chip damage that these big boys do to each other either, they can really fuck each other up and do your work for you. Don't expect the same luxuries for smaller enemies though, because they can't damage each other most of the time. However, you will sometimes find rival groups of humans and monsters fighting amongst themselves in the world, often with no intervention even required from the player. It can be a real hoot to just sit back and watch the carnage unfold, because the action in Elden Ring looks really good regardless of who is fighting. If you've never seen Beyond the Bear's many videos showing this game's bosses fighting each other, check that shit out, it is epic. Once we eventually reach the Divine Tower, it's a simple case of ascending the long elevator upwards. So the Divine Towers in the game's other regions aren't quite so straightforward, each having their own levels and layouts to be overcome before reaching the elevator. At the top, nestled in between 2 enormous cracked stony fingers, floats the shape of a rune where we can restore Godrick's Great Rune to full power, and capping it all off with a beautiful view of the Erdtree, standing many times taller even than the Divine Towers. Each Great Rune provides different benefits, although personally I've always just stuck with Godrick's Rune, which you unlock at this first tower, because to me it's by far the strongest, giving you a boost of +5 to all 8 attributes, equivalent to an extra 40 levels. Other Great Runes unlocked later do things like increasing your HP by a lot, or raising your HP, stamina and FP, or restoring HP by defeating enemies, but I don't know. To me, Godrick's Rune is clearly the best. In fact, I think this rune's buff should have come towards the end of the game, rather than it being the very first one you get, because the others just pale in comparison. To actually make use of the Great Runes, you need to spend a fairly rare item called a Rune Arc, and this effect lasts up until death, which again is very powerful. Of course, it doesn't feel quite so good if you consume one to get the upper hand on a hard boss, and then immediately die after passing through the fog ball, but the extra damage and durability from popping a Rune Arc really can help. Now that we've obtained our first Great Rune, it's time to head back to the Roundtable Hold, and our welcome is somewhat more ceremonious this time, as we are granted audience to a bizarre being known as the Two Fingers, as well as the finger reading Enya, who interprets the words of the Two Fingers and relays them back to us. The Two Fingers are a very mysterious entity in the Lands Between, and although they are often referred to as the Two Fingers, we already know that there's more than one of these creatures, having just seen a dead one at the top of the Limgrave Divine Tower, as well as others later. The Two Fingers are believed to be envoys of the Greater Will, although the extent to which this is actually true is cast into doubt by some characters throughout the game, who believe that the Two Fingers are decrepit and senile. To add to the dubiousness of all this, the Greater Will itself is such a nebulous, mysterious force that it's hard to really pin down anything solid about it. Furthermore, as I said, the Two Fingers don't even directly correspond with us. It's all done through finger reader Enya, and thus there is a lot left deliberately ambiguous. Will the DLC clear up things like these? Possibly. Will the DLC end up leaving us with more questions than answers? Probably. At this point in the game, what we have to do next is quite clear. We need to acquire more Great Runes, and to do that, we've got to journey to other regions of the Lands Between. The majority of players at this point will head to Liurnia, just north of Limgrave, and easily accessible directly after Godrick's throne room. However, there is actually another region directly connected to Limgrave. Yes, there's Caelid too, however we'll get to Caelid in the next video. But a region I totally missed for most of my first playthrough is the Weeping Peninsula, accessible from the Bridge of Sacrifice to the south of Limgrave. I remember looking up where to find some particular upgrade material online and seeing people saying, oh, you can find these at this dungeon in the Weeping Peninsula. And then I was thinking, what the fuck is the Weeping Peninsula? It's just kind of easy to miss because nothing really directs you towards it narratively, and in fact 100% of this whole region is optional. That said, it's definitely worth exploring, and I usually do so after beating Godrick and before getting properly started on Liurnia. For one, there are 3 churches on the peninsula, and these are well worth a visit because 1, they'll often come with interesting lore-related dialogue from Melina, and 2, churches are where the player finds sacred tears. Sacred tears simply enhance the potency of your healing flask, increasing its strength by 1 point for each sacred tear found. The other upgrade material related to your flask is of course golden seeds, with these being found lying near small Erdtree saplings, and golden seeds will increase your potential number of healing flask uses. Nothing too revolutionary here, and pretty much the same system used in Dark Souls 3 with Estus Flask Shards and Undead Bone Shards, but being able to find 3 sacred tears at the easily accessible Weeping Peninsula is pretty damn significant, especially when you're just getting started with the game. Even from your starting point in Limgrave, there are a good 4 or 5 fairly nearby churches you could ride to just to collect a bunch of sacred tears right off the bat, not to mention the various golden seeds dotted around. Like every other above ground region, the Weeping Peninsula is also host to a minor Erdtree, except unlike the one we saw in the Mistwood in Limgrave, this one is guarded by an Erdtree avatar. There are certain bosses in Elden Ring which you'll see repeated a lot, and in fact, this is considered one of the game's biggest flaws, and I'll discuss the enemy variety topic more in one of the next videos, but perhaps the 2 most common bosses in the game are the Tree Spirits and the Erdtree avatars. The keen-eyed Souls veterans among you will likely spot something quite uncanny about the avatars upon first seeing them, because they are of course based on the Asylum demon from Dark Souls, which was itself of course based on the Vanguard from Demon Souls. Although very common, I really enjoy fighting the avatars. They're very slow but hit very hard, and just when you think they're out of range, they somehow manage to hit you anyway with a forward lunge and slam with their heavy Erdtree staff. These things tend to have large health pools, but you really can wail on them due to their rather sluggish nature, though often after just a few attacks they'll do that characteristic Asylum demon butt slam, keeping you away. Their most annoying attack though is the Golden Land Shockwave, followed by its high damage golden projectiles which will continue to blast you for several seconds afterwards, all the while the avatar gears up for yet another long range slam. It's not so bad when they do this attack just every now and then, but sometimes they will just spam it, especially if you've got even a little bit of range on them, and it gets pretty obnoxious because the player's only viable recourse when they do this attack is to sprint away or find cover. My least favourite attacks in any Souls game are always the ones where you don't have any viable counter available to you and just have to hide until the attack is done. But after toppling this ambulatory tree, we are of course rewarded with 2 more crystal tiers. From here on, every minor Erdtree will be accompanied by a boss fight, almost always with some type of Erdtree avatar, or in some cases a tree spirit. Also found on the peninsula is our first mausoleum. These things look absolutely incredible and were another creature we were treated to seeing back when the first gameplay trailer was released. But unlike almost everything else in Elden Ring, we don't technically fight these things. You might not even initially realise that you can interact with them at all, but attacking the faint white skull build-ups at the bottom of their legs will eventually cause them to lower themselves down into the ground, allowing the player to travel up and into the mausoleum atop their backs, though not every such mausoleum can be accessed with this exact method. The actual function of these buildings is kinda strange, but also cool. See, when you beat a major boss in Elden Ring, you'll be rewarded with a remembrance, like the one we got after defeating Godrick. These function in the exact same way as boss souls from the Dark Souls series, and can be sold or popped for a generous number of souls, or traded to Enya for a boss weapon, item, or spell. The difference is, in Dark Souls, if you use up a boss soul, then it's gone forever, at least until you fight that thing again on New Game Plus. Here though, you can use a remembrance several times if you really want, because you can simply regenerate it at a mausoleum. I actually did this a couple of times in this playthrough when I was really short on runes, just so I could pop a powerful remembrance for an extra, say 30,000 runes to afford a new weapon upgrade or some such. The main attraction on the Weeping Peninsula, however, is Morne Castle. See, there's no demigod or great rune in this region, but Morne Castle still is a legacy dungeon of sorts, lying at the southernmost point of the entire game map. At the very start of the region, after entering it from Limgrave across the Bridge of Sacrifice, we see a young blind woman named Renna sitting on a rock. The servants in the castle have rebelled out of nowhere and began to run rampant, killing all the humans in an animalistic frenzy, and she tasks us with delivering a letter to her father, who is the commander at Castle Morne. Funny thing here though, I went and sat at the nearby Point of Grace and came back to this spot nearly immediately, and Renna was already dead. She always dies in any playthrough I've done anyway, and I don't think there's actually a way to avoid this, but I didn't realise the game just immediately kills her as soon as you leave this spot. Anyway, Castle Morne is indeed a morbid, burning bloodbath with stacks of smoking corpses piled high. Also, we see that the frenzied servants in question here are Misbegotten, the same race of people as Master Hugh back in the Roundtable Hold. Although I truly do love the dark, disturbing tone of Elden Ring, I sometimes think it lays it on a bit too thick. For example, look at how many bodies here there are in this pile. Now, I'm not looking for realism from a FromSoft game. That's the opposite of what I want, obviously, but the excessiveness of it kinda dampens the potential impact that the brutality here could otherwise have had. The same sort of thing is done at other areas in the game too, but the game just lays it all on a bit too thick for my liking. As a level, Castle Morne is enjoyable enough to play through, but nowhere near as large or intricate as someplace like Stormveil Castle. We do see Arena's father, who turns out to be quite a nice chap, although unfortunately there's no way to tell him that his daughter is dead, even though we know she is. The main prize of Castle Morne is a treasured sword, and so after descending down and out onto a coastal outcrop, we come across the boss of the area. Cool design for a boss, and of course this one looks quite distinct from the other Misbegotten in the area. This is far from any unique encounter though, and we will see these guys a bunch more throughout the game as regular enemies. But beating it gets us the Grafted Greatsword, a legendary weapon and one which I was actually thinking of using but then decided against it because I think it somehow manages to look both badass and ridiculous at the same time. The Weeping Peninsula is probably the least distinctive amongst all the game's regions, looking very similar to Limgrave, but it's still really goddamn big with lots of cool shit to see and do, and it gives the player some extra upgrade materials, runes and equipment before they carry on with the mission for more great runes. And speaking of that mission, it is time to head northwards to the next region, Liurnia. As far as I can tell, Liurnia is the largest region in all the lands between, and by far the easiest place to miss things. The region is absolutely beautiful, with a large central zone being comprised of an extremely shallow lake, surrounded by higher cliffs and outcrops on all sides, and at the very centre of Liurnia lies the Academy of Raya Lucaria, the home of Rennala of the Full Moon, who is in possession of the next great rune. See, at its core, sorcery in Elden Ring operates in much the same way as it did in the Dark Souls games. You find or buy spells, equip a staff and use FP to cast those spells, except where sorcery revolved around soul magic in Dark Souls with things like Soul Arrow and Soul Spear. The most common type of sorcery in this game is derived from a strange bluish green crystal known as glintstone, and you see this stuff all over Liurnia, particularly within the lake and in the depths of Raya Lucaria. With the astral power contained within the glintstone, sorcerers can cast powerful magic, though there are actually a silly number of other categories of sorcery in Elden Ring also, and a grand total of 70 different spells to find, and that's not even including the over 100 different incantations in the game, which scale with the faith stat rather than intelligence, and which require seals instead of staffs to cast spells from. On my first playthrough of Elden Ring, I went with a faith and dex build, and so made use of incantations and weapons which did holy damage, but on this playthrough I was of course going for a strength and intelligence build, so used a lot of spells, though I did change builds around halfway through the game to a pure strength build, because I was getting a wee bit bored with the whole magic thing. For the first chunk of the game, I mainly only used the spell that the prisoner class starts with, that being Magic Blaidd, and to be honest, I was pretty damn satisfied with this basic spell, and delivered some more than decent damage to a bunch of early bosses using it. Of course, with this game having 70 other sorceries to use, I was eager to try out some of the other ones, and by visiting another easily missable set of ruins in Limgrave and defeating the mad Pumpkinhead boss lurking below, we come across a witch named Selin, wearing the distinctive robes and eccentric headwear of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, although Selin does seem to be the only female character at the Academy, apart from its leader Rennala. If your intelligence stat is high enough, then Selin will allow you to be her apprentice and teach you sorceries. Plus, if you find scrolls out in the lands between, then that will expand her range of purchasable sorceries. The main ones I used were Magic Blaidd, Great Glintstone Shard, and Glintstone Arc, with that latter spell in particular being excellent for clearing out groups of weaker enemies. Any attack capable of hitting many enemies with the one strike or projectile is always a good old time for me. There are some incredibly powerful sorceries in this game, and indeed for the first few months of the game being out, a lot of people used a late game spell with an intelligence requirement of 60 called Comet Azure to absolutely destroy bosses in cheap but spectacular fashion, although I don't know if this strat is still viable these days, because there has been a ton of balance changes over the past year and a half, and a lot of stuff got nerfed. I myself did not try out any particularly fancy sorceries in this playthrough, but ranged offense is always well worth utilising in Elden Ring, regardless of whether it's incantations, sorceries, consumables, bows or jars. Enemies can get very scary in this game, and so it can really save your arse if you've got a way to pick them off from a distance. When I first played Elden Ring back in February of 2022, I discovered a strange feature in Liurnia which I still don't quite understand to this day. I started out on the lake from the south, not too far from the rear of Stormveil Castle, and then I travelled north a bit until I came across a strange portal under a stone gazebo. This was still early on in the region, and I hadn't seen a portal like this anywhere else in the game yet, so I took a chance and entered through it, and then it skipped me straight past almost all the content in Liurnia and walked me right outside the gates to the Academy of Raya Lucaria, which serves as Liurnia's legacy dungeon. Now you can't actually enter just yet because you first need a glintstone key, but I still don't get why this portal or other such portals exist in the game. There's already the option to skip enormous chunks and entire regions of the game world, and yet even with these allowances they put this portal here too? It makes no sense because if you want to get here via conventional means, you need to fight through a bunch of knights and flame chariots, as well as the sunken remnants of the city before it, as well as all the other wonders and dangers and treasures found in and around the lake. Yet you can just skip all of it thanks to a random portal which doesn't even give you any indication or clue of what it will do. As a result, I saw barely any of Liurnia on my first playthrough, and it wasn't until my second playthrough that I explored the place thoroughly and discovered how absurdly massive it was. In fact, you barely even have to explore the uplands to the west and east of the map if you don't want to, not to mention the totally optional Caria Manor legacy dungeon to the northwest. Pretty much all the great rune related stuff is based in the lake area. Not far from the aforementioned portal, in a location called the Lasciar Ruins, several enemies called Revenants appear up out of the stone upon the player's approach. They're really not too much of a pain to deal with. However, the true menace in this area is a creature called the Royal Revenant, and I think this is my least favourite enemy in the entire fucking game. They are a nightmare to beat. They're crazy fast, barely stop attacking, can teleport around the arena, and are just really difficult for me to read. I panic. These things turn up in a few locations throughout the game, and they're another one of those enemies, along with the Grafted Scion, but I still don't really know how you're supposed to fight them effectively. I mean, I usually beat them in the end, but it always costs me way more healing flasks than I'm happy with. One of the many attractive attributes of Soulsborne games is knowing that if you're good enough at an enemy or boss, then it's possible to beat them without taking a single hit. It might take great experience, practice and precision, but you can do it. But with Elden Ring, although this philosophy still does hold true for the most part, I feel that there are certain enemies and bosses where achieving this level of competency has never been less achievable. Possible? Yes, but reasonable? I don't think so. There are other horrors prowling the lakes of Liurnia too, like these lobster crawfish things. There are still crabs in Elden Ring, so don't think that they've been fully replaced, don't worry about that. But yeah, new kids are on the block too. These monsters can actually be really tough to fight, although the friendly fire aspect certainly helps when there are more than one of them around. The deadliest attack by far though is the lightning fast water projectile, which has some surprisingly long range. While the magical and majestic Academy of Raya Lucaria stands proudly at the centre of the lake, just before it there is a sunken town populated by an odd looking people with bulbous heads and black eyes. Very foolish looking enemies, but these things are actually a race of artificially created people called Albinaurics, specifically second generation Albinaurics. These variants of this synthetic race of people are found in certain places throughout the lake area of Liurnia, but also in the consecrated snowfields and in the bloody Mogwin Palace, where they exhibit some rather alarming behaviours. Very odd and enigmatic enemy, and I kinda wish there was some second generation Albinauric NPC in the game to interact with to find out more about them. Of course, there are also the first generation Albinaurics who, rather confusingly, look completely different, essentially resembling humans but with non-functioning legs. To the southwest of Liurnia, past a poison swamp, lies the village of the Albinaurics, although there are none of the fat frog ones here. Unfortunately, the village was recently wiped out, and the only Albinaurics left here have lost their minds, but there is just one sane one left, Albus, and he gives the player a very important item, one half of the Erdtree secret medallion, required to gain access to the consecrated snowfield region of the game, though we're a long way off from that yet. Liurnia also has its own mausoleum to the north of the lake, but this is the first one where the method for lowering it differs, because instead of knocking off skulls attached to its feet, you have to use a nearby spirit spring to jump onto it when it gets close enough. It's actually a bit of a pain in the arse achieving this though, because you need to sit and wait for it to slowly walk close enough to the spirit spring or it'll simply be out of range. There are actually an additional 2 mausoleums located elsewhere in Liurnia though, with both of them being found in the Old Palace ruins area to the northeast. A lot of people had already seen the massive mausoleum creatures from that very first gameplay trailer that got everyone so hyped 2 years ago, including me, but that feeling when you first see one of these things jump high, so fucking sick, dude. Elden Ring is amazing at making the player feel wonder, which is exactly what a good open world game is supposed to do, like Red Dead 2 or The Witcher 3. This game is filled with moments designed to make you stop and stare, and with it being a full-on dark fantasy title, FromSoft were free to go full-on with the outlandish creatures and landscapes of the lands between. Sometimes those landscapes are beautiful enough to resemble a work of art, while others are horrifying and hellish. Either way, they managed to create a wonderful, wondrous game world which succeeded in evoking real feelings and planting great memories in the hearts and minds of millions of players worldwide. Back after we helped out Blaidd take out that Bloodhound Knight and that Evergaol in Limgrave, he mentioned a friend of his that we should look out for, and that friend is to be found in Liurnia, far along the road in West Liurnia. He's a massive troll, although clearly an eccentric one, because not only is he totally non-hostile, but he's an absolute sweetheart named Agheel. Agheel is also a blacksmith and is a great resource for some lower level sombre smithing stones early on, but his purpose here is to warn you away from the large stately manor yonder that way, saying that there is a magic snare being set up to ward off any would-be trespassers or treasure hunters. Come on, how dangerous can it be? Oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck. To be honest though, it's actually really easy to avoid this magic thing. And getting to this place, called Caria Manor, ain't too hard. Although not the home of any demigod, it still follows the usual legacy dungeon restrictions, and so this is a no-horse zone. Also, as usual, this location is totally optional, although vital if you're going for the Age of the Stars ending, which I am. Just outside the manor though is an invisible wee critter frantically running laps around a shallow pond, and taking this thing out gets us an Ash of War. Wow, he's actually bigger than I thought. Of course, this sure isn't the first time we've seen one of these scarabs, and in fact, they are everywhere, though most of them are fully visible. Some restore some Crimson Flask uses, others restore Cerulean Flask uses, some reward you with sombre smithing stones, while many others give you fun new Ashes of War to try out. Like I said earlier, Ashes of War are special skills you can equip onto your weapons, and most of the ones you'll see out in the world are rewards for finding and killing these scarabs, though some can be bought. Not every Ash of War can be attached to any old weapon though, and some can only be equipped onto weapons of a particular type. For example, the Mighty Shot Ash of War is specifically for bows, while the Stormcaller Ash of War is restricted to swords capable of slashing, axes, hammers and polearms. As well as your melee focused Ashes of War, there are also those which do elemental damage, and so might be very effective when used with specific builds. Furthermore, if you find a lightning related Ash of War and equip it onto your weapon, then you can make use of lightning scaling, same with blood scaling or magic scaling, etc. Though finding the various wet blades hidden throughout the world gives the player even more freedom to customise different Ashes of War with the elemental scaling of their choice. I mentioned before that Ashes of War are kinda similar to the weapon arts from Dark Souls 3, except that in Elden Ring you can mix and match those weapon arts. But another difference between the two games, as far as this feature is concerned, is that weapon arts often felt somewhat superfluous in Dark Souls 3. They were fun to use every now and then, but I never really felt like I needed them. They have far greater utility in Elden Ring though, especially when you consider the sheer number of them, 91 by the way. They can be super powerful, and in some cases it's so powerful that FromSoft had to nerf the fuck out of them. One that I did have a lot of fun with near the beginning of the game was Ground Slam, because it did surprisingly excellent AoE damage, although I was a bit underwhelmed by some others like Carrion Greatsword, which looked awesome but took way too long to use. Also, for special weapons and boss weapons, they will have fixed Ashes of War which you cannot swap out, though these are often quite thematic to the origin of the weapon, so the Ashes of War in these weapons can be very fun to use. Then again, you can get stuck with a shitty Ash of War on an otherwise awesome weapon, like when I started using the Dragon Greatclaw a good bit into the game, which permanently had the Endure Ash of War fixed onto it. Boring. I don't want Endure, I want the Anal Slam. Caria Manor is a very misty, creepy place, and the only people left here are some aggressive first generation Albinorics. The new king of the manor is Hand. Jeez, I must have been tired when I wrote that into the script. These creepy, spidery, scuttling grotesqueries are found in a few places around the lands between, but Caria Manor is the first place most folk will encounter them, and this place is damn well infested. You have to watch where you walk here, because many of them lie in anticipation of their next victim, poised beneath the ground like trapdoor spiders. There are a lot of smaller ones, but these things grow to massive sizes, and like many creatures in Elden Ring, can fuck you up. Truly an incredible enemy design, and it really taps into that creepy, uncanny thing where you look at it and think, hold on, a hand should not have 10 fingers, nor should they be that big. Get out of my sight. The raw meaty stump on their rear end is also a great, gross touch, and they're actually pretty easy to kill if you do manage to get behind them like this. Most of Caria Manor seems to be outdoors, and the majority of traversal here will be through misty gardens, fighting spectres and wolves, though eventually you do come to some stairs guarded by some imposing enemies, including this troll knight who I got an awesome magic sword from, which I'd use for the next chunk of the game. At the top of the stairs is Royal Knight Loretta, though not the real deal, just the spirit version of her. Just as the player can summon spirits to aid them in battle, many enemies and even bosses in the game are also merely spirit projections. In fact, the Margit boss back in Limgrave was just a spirit projection of the real person. The actual Margit is somewhere completely different, and we will fight him later. And it's also not uncommon to see regular enemies out in the world just appear from thin air in glowing spirit form. For me, Royal Knight Loretta has never been a difficult boss at all. I know a lot of people find her really tough, especially the true Loretta who we fight later on in the Erdtree, but she's just never been a hard boss in my book. Even on my level 1 run through the game, I didn't find her at all challenging. Not bragging or anything, because I've struggled in misery for hours on many parts of this game, but just not Loretta. With her being a mounted enemy, several of her basic moves are actually shared across other mounted bosses in the game, like the Draconic Tree Sentinel and the Knight's Cavalry, though Loretta has a suite of carrying magic at her disposal also, and one of the rewards for being her is actually one of her moves, Loretta's Great Bow, which I'd never used before but turned out to be a really fun sorcery. I'm a sucker for any move that you can charge up to make it bigger and more powerful. After beating Loretta, the player enters into one of the most striking locations in the game, with enormous crystals of luminous glintstone jutting out from the ground with 3 towers looming in the distance, not to mention a huge dragon guarding one of those towers, though I avoid fighting it here because I remember that it just flies off after taking a wee bit of damage anyway, only to show up at a different location later on in the game. In this curious misty corner of Liurnia, the player can once again encounter Renna, the girl who we first met back at the church in Limgrave under the gaze of the moon. And this is where we can progress Blaidd's questline, it being closely interconnected to Renna, or should I say Princess Ranni's questline, as well as the Age of the Stars ending. We enter into Ranni's service here, joining her small cohort of followers, those being Blaidd, E.G. and also this cunt who I only spoke to one additional time this playthrough, though he does have his own twisted questline to follow. See, although the Ranni we see before us appears as a cute wee doll, this isn't her actual body. I mean, for a start, she has 4 arms. Ranni herself is a demigod born from the human Rennala, head of the Carian royal family and leader of the Raya Lucaria Academy, and the god Radagon of the Golden Order. Also, just for clarity, Ranni's siblings are General Radagon and Praetor Rykard. The whole demigod family tree can get a bit confusing on a first playthrough of this game, and so it helps to look up a helpful chart every now and then. Ranni made comments about the obeisance of the Tarnished to the Two Fingers back when we first met her, and indeed the downfall of the Two Fingers is one of her ambitions, rejecting their so-called guidance and control. Furthermore, she reveals here that she was the one behind the Night of the Black Knives, that calamitous event which led to the death of Godwyn the Golden, ostensibly causing Marika to shatter the Elden Ring, leading to the War of the Shattering and the state of decay and ruin which the lands between now finds itself so thoroughly entrenched. The first task Ranni gives us is to help out Blaidd in locating the hidden treasure of a lost city called Nokron, but before venturing down into the whole other world that exists underground, we still have a great rune to obtain here in Liurnia. Although you can march right up to the front gate of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, or simply take a portal there, there's a magic barrier totally sealing off the entrance to the place. A bald man named Top, found back at the start of Liurnia near Stormveil Castle, informs us that a glintstone key is the one and only way to gain entry to the academy, and so we'll be needing one of those, please. Luckily for us, there's a handy map literally right outside the entrance indicating the location of a glintstone key, though it requires a wee bit of reference to the main map to discern where it is. The game does this 2 or 3 times, and I always appreciate stuff like this and think more games could do with having a more hands-off approach when it comes to guiding the player along to specific locations, giving directions and hints rather than a marker showing exactly where to go. Elden Ring does allow the player to set markers or beacons on the maps though, which is a nice touch, and I myself set a beacon right where the glintstone key was, right behind a fucking magic dragon. Functionally, Smaragd here is pretty much identical to Agheel who we fought before, except instead of breathing fire, it breathes powerful glintstone sorceries from its mouth, and sometimes bathes the area in a bright blue fire, though I admit I did get a bit salty from this particular death. After claiming the key and defeating the dragon, although this is actually an optional fight, we can finally enter the grounds of the academy, initiating our hunt for Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon and bearer of the great rune of the Unborn. Although the academy looks majestic and enchanting from a distance, the academy grounds themselves are absolutely stunning, with the moment of its reveal being reminiscent of that first sight of Irithyll back in Dark Souls 3. This is an academy of magic, but best get any quaint ideas of Hogwarts out of your head, because despite this being a place of great astral wisdom, tarnished are not welcome. Robed scholars walk the halls, many of them deep in study and contemplation, with the form of their characteristic headwear indicating their rank and seniority in the academy. Whereas Stormveil was a stone castle guarded by knights, trolls and various forms of firepower, Raya Lucaria's main defences against the rune-hungry tarnished are sorceries and the uncanny marionette automatons who prowl the halls and rooftops of the academy. An aura of magical mystery permeates every room of this level, and just like Stormveil, it is large and holds many secrets and horrors. Despite its beauty, there are barely concealed grave sites from which shambling putrid corpses rise who drain the player's FP upon attack, and one particularly frightful room houses a large graven mage ball, the form and appearance of which betrays some rather sinister implications around the culture and practices of the academy. A massive mechanical elevator is present, allowing ascension or descent to different heights of the academy. At the very base of the elevator, we are greeted with one of the most disturbing enemy designs in the game, that of the Virgin Maiden, resembling a mother holding a child, except 14 foot tall, made of metal, and with whirligig saws for arms, so exactly like your mum then. These are of course machines, although as you quickly find out if the victim of its vicious grab attack, these machines are given motion by snakes housed within their base. Although common knowledge amongst players at this point, if your health happens to be fully depleted by this grab attack, then you don't actually die, but instead are transported to the late game area Volcano Manor, which sits atop Mount Gelmir, which lies adjacent to the Altus Plateau and the Erdtree capital of Leyndell. This is actually a really effective way of getting to that area and then Altus Plateau, because the other methods of reaching there require much more work, whereas this method just requires you to, die. It must have been a rather bewildering feeling for the first person who discovered this crazy means of transportation, though unfortunately it never happened to me and I only heard about this trick afterwards. I was not one of its pioneers. Closer to the top of the academy, however, we come across our first boss of the area, the Red Wolf of Radagon. See, the god Radagon had quite a strong connection to this place, having previously been married to Rennala, thus having influence over the Carian royal family and the goings-on at the academy, and indeed his Red Wolf remains here still, sharing the same red-coloured hair as Radagon. This boss is kind of a throwback to good old Great Grey Wolf Sif, except this wolf can materialise a spectral golden sword at will and is significantly more adept at the use of magic, calling forth magic glint blades and roaring glintstone comet shards. Although I usually don't have much of a problem with this boss, you find it again later on in the game as a regular old enemy, and this one in particular, found much later in the Siofra River, utterly fucked me up. You ever fight an enemy in one of these games where you just can't nail down the timing of its attacks, where you're dancing a different dance entirely to the enemy? Very annoying. Still, cute dog. After the wolf, we can climb higher still past these infinitely spawning metal balls through to the courtyard near the elevator to Rennala's chamber. By the way, Elden Ring really does have a thing for hurling massive magical balls at the player, and I love it. And later still, we fight large sentient black balls as an actual enemy with a health bar and everything. In the courtyard itself though, waits one of the most annoying human enemies in the game, Moongrum. The most dangerous thing about this guy by far is that he's not at all shy about parrying, making it highly inadvisable to go for a full frontal attack when he has his shield out, with guard counters being the smart play here. Guard counters were a brand new mechanic introduced in Elden Ring, allowing the player to follow up a block with a powerful counter, dealing great damage and especially stance damage. This can be done regardless of whether you block with a shield or a weapon, and in many cases a successful guard counter will be enough to fully stagger the enemy, thus allowing the player to go in for a powerful critical hit. These are super effective on parry happy enemies like Moongrum, although if the enemy immediately follows up the attack that you blocked with its successive attack while you're in the middle of the guard counter animation, then you are left completely vulnerable. For me, guard counters seemed like a borderline overpowered new mechanic at the beginning of the game, and then I realised that they weren't quite as effective against a lot of the game's harder, more aggressive enemies and bosses, but still made for a great tool against smaller foes like imps or knights. After Moongrum is turned into Moongrub, we can proceed up to Rennala's chambers for our second major fight, though it must be pointed out that Rennala herself is not actually a demigod. She just holds a great rune within the amber egg gifted to her by Radagon before their marriage was annulled. Rather, her children, Ranni, Radahn and Rykard, are demigods due to the role that Margit played in their conception. After the incredible and gruesome fight with Godrick back at Stormveil Castle, I had my fingers crossed for a similarly epic battle here at the top of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, and folks, I was not disappointed.
Hush, little Calva. I'll soon birth thee anew, a sweeting, fresh and pure.
Rennala's chamber is filled with malformed children, vapidly smiling and frolicking, only to die and then be reborn as their mother hovers above the ground in a protective amber shell, animating various objects and furniture around the room, intended to damage and crush the tarnished, but often also wiping out the children themselves. Also, the off-time singing of the children here isn't part of the actual soundtrack. That's just the sounds they make during battle here, and I think it really adds an extra melancholy element to this already tremendous boss soundtrack. The first phase is quite easy, though it certainly might not be immediately apparent what the strategy should be. The children with the golden auras emanating from them must be attacked, and upon the third one being interrupted, Rennala's shell will break and she will be temporarily vulnerable to damage. This cycle will usually have to be completed 3 times or 2 if you've got really great damage output, but when her health is depleted, the true fight begins.
My beloved, have no fear. I will hold thee. Patience. Ye will be countless born, forever and ever.
Upon my name as Ranni the Witch. Mother's rich slumber shall not be disturbed by thee. send word far and wide. Of the last queen of Caria, Rennala of the full moon. And the majesty of the night she conjureth.
So here in Phase 2, although the detail is quite easy to miss, we are actually doing battle with a summoned spirit version of Rennala, not the real person. Indeed, you can hear Ranni's voice triggering the appearance of Rennala of the full moon, as the Carrion Queen originally was in her prime. The boss arena for Phase 1 was great, but the space we're transported to in the second phase is stunning, a blue lake bathed in lunar splendour. Whereas before Rennala mostly rambled from within her protective golden barrier, now she pulls no punches, hitting the player with the most powerful, spectacular sorceries in the book. Furthermore, from around the halfway point in the fight, she'll summon help in the form of a troll, a dragon or a bloodhound knight, and even when you defeat one of these spirits, she will immediately just summon another one right after. Difficulty wise, if you try and fight Rennala too soon, she can actually be a real challenge, and in fact, I struggled with her a bunch on my first playthrough because of all the stuff in Liurnia that I skipped because of that fucking portal. However, if you've explored a decent bit beforehand in Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula and Liurnia itself, then she really isn't too much of a challenge, though regardless of the difficulty, this is a beautiful, spectacular and memorable boss fight. Afterwards, we see Rennala vacantly sitting in her chair, head low to one side, spouting off disconnected nonsense, and it's clear that the Queen's best days are long behind her. Although we do get her Great Rune from this fight, we don't actually kill Rennala, and in fact, as long as the player has a spare larval tier item, then they can return here and respec all their stats whenever they like from this point onwards. I did this myself around halfway into the game, converting my magic strength build into a pure strength build, then again later on, switching to a quality build with an equal emphasis on both strength and dexterity. Now, although we've gotten our hands on another Great Rune, and although there is indeed a Divine Tower in Liurnia to the east, Rennala's happens to be the only Great Rune which the player cannot actually equip or use, being somewhat unique compared to the rest. That said, Liurnia's Divine Tower is still well worth a visit, though the player is quite limited in what they can do here at this point. There are various enemies, and there is treasure here, and it's worth taking note of the layout, but only once getting much further in on Ranni's questline should we come back here with a particular key item which causes this study hall to undergo a rather dramatic transformation. And folks, that will be all for the first video in this series. We covered Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula and Liurnia, but there are still so many areas, bosses, enemies and mechanics and more to talk about, hence why I decided to divide this series up into multiple parts. In the next episode, I guess, we'll be returning to the Roundtable Hold before venturing out into the most terrifying and unnerving region in the game, Caelid, as well as covering some of the vast underground sections of the Lands Between, and also the glorious Golden Altus Plateau, or Atlas Plateau, as I originally thought it was called. I hope you enjoyed my commentary and analysis of this incredible game, and I sure hope you'll join me again for the next video. Cheers for watching and cheerio.